The afternoon passed the way it always did in that part of rural Indiana, slow and unremarkable, the kind of day that never announced itself as important. In the spring of 2001, the elementary school emptied out just after 3 o'clock, children spilling onto the front steps with backpacks that looked too big for their shoulders. Teachers stood nearby, watching until the last bus pulled away and the last parent waved from a pickup truck. For the kids who lived close enough, walking home was routine. It was normal, it was trusted. She was 10 years old, small for her age, with hair her mother braided most mornings and a habit of tugging at the straps of her backpack when she walked. She had taken the same route home since the beginning of the school year. Out the front doors, past the flagpole, along the narrow paved road that faded into gravel just beyond the school boundary. A quarter-mile later, the road bent slightly and ran alongside a tree line that separated farmland from woods. Everyone in town knew that stretch. It had always been there. Nothing bad had ever happened there. That afternoon, teachers remembered her like they remembered dozens of other days. She smiled, waved once, and joined a small cluster of kids heading in the same direction. One classmate later recalled that she talked about homework, about what she might have for dinner, ordinary things. When the group split, she turned onto the gravel road alone, her sneakers kicking up dust as she went. That was the last confirmed sighting. At home, her mother expected to hear the familiar sound of the screen door sometime before 4. It was never exact. Sometimes she stopped to talk to neighbors. Sometimes she dragged her feet. When 4 o'clock passed, there was no concern. By 4:30, there was still no sound of footsteps. Her mother checked the driveway, then the yard. By 5, unease crept in, the kind that made the air feel heavier than it should have. They called a neighbor first. No, she hadn't stopped by. Another call followed, then another. The assumption was simple. She must be at a friend's house. She must have wandered off. Children did that. Rural kids especially. They knew the land. They were trusted to roam. But when the sun started to sink and dinner went untouched on the table, the assumptions collapsed. Her father drove the route she always walked, slow enough to look into ditches and between trees. There was no backpack on the roadside, no shoe, no sign she had even passed through. The road looked exactly the way it always had. By the time they called the sheriff's office, it was already dark. Deputies arrived treating it as a missing child, not a crime. They asked the standard questions. What was she wearing? Who was the last person to see her? Had she ever run away before? The answers were simple and consistent. She had never disappeared like this. She was afraid of the dark. She would not have stayed out on purpose. Word spread fast in a town, and that small. Within an hour, headlights lined the road. Volunteers gathered with flashlights, forming loose lines that moved through fields and along fence lines. Someone brought dogs. Someone brought extra batteries. People shouted her name into the trees over and over until their voices grew hoarse. The woods near the gravel road became the focus almost immediately. They were dense but not vast, the kind of place children played during the day and avoided at night. Deputies reasoned that if she had wandered off the road, she might be lost or injured. That made sense. It was logical. It was comforting. The search went on past midnight. No one wanted to stop. Every time a light flickered in the distance, hope surged, then faded. Dogs tracked scents that went nowhere. Deputies marked areas that had already been checked, methodical even in the chaos. Her backpack was never found. By morning, state police were involved. A command post was set up near the school. Flyers were printed and handed out. The girl's photograph, taken just months earlier for school records, stared back from every page. Her smile looked wrong now, frozen in a moment that no longer existed. Investigators walked the route again, this time measuring distances, noting sight lines, asking themselves who could see what from where. The road was exposed in places, hidden in others. There were no security cameras, no businesses, no traffic cameras. This was rural Indiana, not a city. People relied on memory and honesty. Teachers were interviewed, classmates were interviewed, everyone told the same story. She left school, she walked home, she never arrived. As hours turned into days, the tone shifted. This was no longer a child who had simply wandered off. This was a disappearance without evidence, without witnesses, without noise. That was harder to accept, harder to explain. Parents began keeping their children closer. Doors were locked earlier. The unspoken question passed between people in grocery store aisles and church pews. How could a child vanish on a road everyone trusted? Investigators considered the obvious possibilities first. A stranger passing through, an opportunistic abduction, a vehicle that stopped briefly and drove away. But there were no reports of suspicious cars. No one remembered hearing a scream. No one remembered anything out of place. The family sat through interview after interview, repeating the same details until they blurred together. They walked deputies through their home. They answered questions about family dynamics, about discipline, about arguments. It was routine, but it hurt all the same. They wanted help, not scrutiny, but they understood the process. Extended family members arrived to support them. Among them was her uncle, someone who had always been around, someone the girl knew well. He joined the searches. He stood with the family during briefings. He spoke softly, reassuringly, telling anyone who would listen that she would be found. No, one questioned that. Why would they? As the second night fell, exhaustion set in. The search area expanded outward, mile by mile. Creeks were checked, old sheds were opened, abandoned farm equipment was inspected. Each negative result tightened the knot in everyone's chest. By the third day, national missing child organizations were contacted. The case crossed county lines on paper, but physically, it remained anchored to that gravel road and those woods. Investigators kept coming back to the same conclusion. Someone had to have seen something, and yet no one had. The idea that danger came from outside the town was easier to accept. A stranger, a passerby, someone unknown. That explanation preserved the belief that home was safe, that familiarity meant protection. No one wanted to think about the alternative. As the search continued with no results, frustration and fear began to replace hope. The girl's name echoed through the woods less often. Flashlights dimmed. Volunteers returned to work and school, carrying guilt with them. Deputies promised they would not stop looking, but everyone could feel the shift. The urgency of the first hours was gone, replaced by the slow grind of uncertainty. At night, her parents lay awake, listening for a sound they knew would never come. During the day, they answered phones, spoke to reporters, and held on to routines that felt meaningless without her. The road she walked every day stayed exactly the same. Cars passed over it. Wind moved through the trees. Life continued, indifferent to the absence it carried. And somewhere within the growing file of notes, maps, and interview transcripts, the truth was already present, hidden not by distance or complexity, but by trust. A trust that would allow the person responsible to stand close to the family, close to the search, close to the grief, without ever raising suspicion. At least not yet. As days passed and the case edged closer to something no one wanted to name, the town braced itself for the possibility that the answers would not come quickly, and that whatever had happened on that quiet road was only the beginning of a story far darker than anyone was prepared to face. The next morning began with the sound of engines instead of birds. Pickup trucks, patrol cars, and borrowed vans lined the edges of roads that usually sat empty. The disappearance was no longer confined to a family or a single stretch of gravel. It had become the town's problem. State police arrived before noon, bringing structure to what had already become an exhausting effort. Maps were unrolled on hoods of vehicles. Areas were divided into grids. Places that had been searched once were searched again, slower, more deliberately, as if repetition alone might force something to appear. Fields were walked in straight lines, boots brushing through tall grass that left scratches on shins and soaked jeans with morning dew. Old barns were opened, their doors groaning as if disturbed after years of silence. Creeks were checked from bank to bank, volunteers poking at mud and debris with long sticks, careful not to disturb anything that might matter later. In the woods, searchers marked trees with bright tape, a visual record of hope and effort stretching deeper and deeper into the landscape. Helicopters flew overhead in slow, deliberate passes, their noise carrying for miles. From the ground, people looked up, momentarily convinced that the movement in the sky meant progress, that it meant answers were coming. It rarely did. Candlelight vigils began almost immediately. On the second night, dozens of people gathered near the school, holding small flames that flickered in the dark. Some prayed, some cried quietly. Others stood in silence, unsure what to do with their hands or their thoughts. The girl's name was spoken aloud again and again, as if repetition could tether her to the world long enough to bring her back. Flyers appeared everywhere: gas stations, grocery stores, church bulletin boards. Her face, printed in black and white, stared out from windows in 3 counties. The description beneath it was simple and devastating. 10 years old, missing. Last seen walking home from school. Investigators worked alongside the search, not separate from it. They began reconstructing her last known movements minute by minute. Teachers were interviewed again, asked to remember small details that had seemed insignificant at the time. What time did she leave? Who was nearby? Did anyone seem out of place? Classmates were spoken to gently, then again more formally, their stories compared for consistency. Most of them remembered the same thing. She turned onto the gravel road. She kept walking. Nothing strange happened. Neighbors along the route were interviewed next. Some had been home that afternoon. Some had been away. None recalled seeing her pass, which was not unusual. Children walked that road every day without being noticed. That normalcy now felt like a flaw, a gap large enough for something terrible to slip through unseen. Early theories were practical. Perhaps she slipped into the woods and was injured. Perhaps she followed an animal or a sound. Perhaps she got lost and panicked. Dogs were brought back in, tracking scents that twisted and faded until they meant nothing at all. The lack of evidence kept every theory alive and killed each one at the same time. Stranger abduction was discussed quietly among investigators, more openly among residents. People remembered unfamiliar vehicles they had seen days or even weeks earlier, details that grew sharper the longer the girl remained missing. Each tip was logged, each lead was followed. None of them held up. As the days passed, the town existed in a strange in-between state. Businesses stayed open, but conversations always returned to the same subject. Churches filled their pews more than usual. Parents walked their children to bus stops or drove them directly to school, eyes scanning. The roadsides as if danger might suddenly reveal itself. At the girl's home, the phone rang constantly. Reporters called, volunteers checked in. Investigators returned with new questions that sounded painfully similar to the old ones. The family answered them all, clinging to the belief that cooperation would somehow speed the process. Each night, they left a light on, a small, irrational gesture that felt necessary anyway. Extended family remained close. They cooked meals no one had an appetite for. They sat together in living rooms where the air felt permanently heavy. The uncle was there often, offering to help however he could. He spoke with investigators willingly, recounting where he had been, what he had done that day. His story was ordinary, unremarkable, exactly the kind of story that blended into the background of 100 other interviews. By the end of the first week, the search area had expanded far beyond the original route. Counties coordinated. Tips came in from neighboring states. A backpack found in a ditch turned out not to be hers. A child seen with a man at a rest stop was identified as someone else. Each false alarm carried a brief surge of adrenaline, followed by a deeper exhaustion. Investigators faced a growing problem. There was still no crime scene, no physical evidence, no clear moment when the disappearance shifted from possibility to certainty. Without that, everything moved slower, more cautiously. Resources were finite. Time was not on their side. As days turned into weeks, the tone of the investigation changed. The urgency of rescue began to give way to the mechanics of long-term inquiry. Case files grew thicker. Maps were folded and refolded. The number of active searchers dwindled as people returned to their lives, guilt lingering behind them like a shadow. The town changed in subtle but lasting ways. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. Gravel roads that once felt harmless now carried an edge of threat. The woods, once a place of play and familiarity, became something to avoid. The absence of the girl settled into daily life, not as something dramatic, but as something constant. Investigators continued to circle back to the same questions. Who knew her routine? Who had access? Who could have acted without being seen? Family members were revisited, not because of suspicion, but because procedure demanded it. Each interview reopened wounds that had barely begun to scar over. There were moments when hope flared unexpectedly. A tip from a neighboring town, a reported sighting that seemed credible. Each time, investigators followed the thread until it unraveled in their hands. The silence that followed felt heavier than the effort itself. The case did not explode into chaos. It did something worse. It slowly suffocated under the weight of unanswered questions. The lack of resolution became its own kind of presence, shaping conversations, shaping behavior, shaping memory. By the time summer arrived, the search had effectively ended, though no one said the words out loud. Officially, the case remained open. Unofficially, it entered a different phase, one defined by waiting rather than action. The girl's name was still spoken, but less often. Her face remained on flyers, edges curling with age. The road she walked every day stayed exactly where it had always been, unchanged, indifferent. And within the quiet that settled over the town, one fact remained unexamined, not because it was hidden, but because it felt unthinkable, that the answers might not lie in the woods, or with a stranger passing through, but with someone who had been present all along, standing close enough to comfort the family, close enough to be trusted, while the search slowly went quiet. As the weeks stretched on and the noise around the case slowly diminished, the investigation did not stop. It narrowed. With the broad searches yielding nothing, detectives began turning inward, focusing less on the landscape and more on the people who existed inside the girl's daily life. This was the stage of the investigation that rarely made headlines, but often mattered the most. Access, opportunity, routine. Who knew where she walked, what time she left school, and how predictable her afternoons really were. The list was not long. Teachers knew her schedule, but not her movements beyond school grounds. Friends knew her route, but had no reason to be near it alone. Neighbors knew the road, but did not know her personally. Family members, however, knew everything. What time she left school, which path she took, how she reacted to authority, who she trusted enough to stop walking for. Investigators reviewed family dynamics carefully, not with accusation, but with necessity. Parents were ruled out early, their movements were verified, their panic was genuine and consistent. Extended family members were interviewed as well, including grandparents, cousins, and one figure who appeared repeatedly in reports, not because of suspicion, but because of presence, her uncle. From the beginning, he had been visible. He was at the house during the early hours after she vanished. He joined the first search parties without hesitation. He stood beside the family at vigils, his hand often resting on a shoulder, his voice steady when others could barely speak. To the community, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a concerned relative, a man desperate for answers. When investigators interviewed him, he did not resist. He answered questions calmly, without defensiveness. He explained where he had been that afternoon, what time he arrived home, who could verify his whereabouts. His timeline was not precise, but it did not need to be. In rural communities, exact minutes were rarely documented. People remembered events in general blocks of time, not by clocks. There were small gaps, moments that were difficult to pin down, but nothing that contradicted known facts. He had reason to be nearby. He often drove those roads. That alone meant nothing. Many people did. As weeks turned into months, investigators revisited statements, looking for anything that had been missed. They compared interviews side by side, searching for discrepancies that might grow clearer with distance from the initial shock. The uncle's account remained largely consistent. Minor differences appeared, but they were the kind common to memory under stress. A detail emphasized once, downplayed another time. A time estimate shifted slightly. None of it crossed the threshold from inconsistency to deception. There was also nothing physical to work with, no vehicle evidence, no fibers, no witnesses placing the girl with him or anyone else. Without a crime scene, there was nothing to anchor suspicion. Investigators could not build a case on intuition or unease, no matter how deeply they wished they could. In a small town, accusing a family member without evidence carried consequences beyond the investigation itself. Reputations mattered, relationships were intertwined. A false accusation could destroy lives and still leave the truth untouched. Detectives were acutely aware of that balance. They pressed when they could. They held back when they had to. The uncle remained close to the family throughout this period. He helped organize paperwork. He drove relatives to interviews. He spoke to volunteers who checked in months later, thanking them for not forgetting. His behavior did not raise alarms. If anything, it reinforced the belief that he was on the same side as everyone else. That was the danger of familiarity. It did not draw attention. It absorbed it. Behind closed doors, investigators discussed him more than he ever realized. Not because he stood out, but because no one else did. When every other lead evaporated, the people closest to the girl were all that remained. They re-examined his access to land in the area, his knowledge of the woods, his understanding of her routine. None of it was illegal, none of it was proof. The investigation stalled, not with a dramatic declaration, but with a quiet acknowledgement of limitations. There were no warrants to pursue, no grounds for surveillance, no evidence to test. The file grew thicker, but not deeper. As time passed, the community's focus shifted. New stories replaced old ones. Children grew older. Parents grew tired of being afraid. The disappearance did not vanish from memory, but it lost its immediacy. It became something people spoke about in the past tense, even though no resolution had ever come. The family lived in a state of suspended grief. Without answers, mourning felt incomplete. They replayed that afternoon endlessly, searching for moments they could have changed. Each anniversary reopened the wound. Each holiday sharpened the absence. The uncle remained present through it all. He attended family gatherings. He marked anniversaries. He spoke of the girl with sadness that seemed genuine. If guilt lived beneath the surface, it did not show itself. Investigators rotated off the case as careers advanced and departments changed. New detectives inherited the file, reading through interviews conducted years earlier, trying to hear urgency in words that had long since cooled. They saw the same problem their predecessors had faced. No evidence, no body, no crime scene, and a suspect who was not officially a suspect. At some point, the case entered the category no one wanted to name. Cold, not closed, not solved, just waiting. The uncle continued his life. He worked, he aged, he blended into the background of a town that had learned how to carry unanswered questions without speaking them aloud. To those around him, he was a man who had endured a tragedy alongside his family, nothing more. The danger, investigators would later realize, was not that he hid. It was that he never needed to. He stood exactly where everyone expected him to stand. Close enough to help. Close enough to be trusted. Close enough to remain invisible. By the time the file was placed on a shelf reserved for cases without movement, the girl had been gone longer than she had ever been alive. The town had gone quiet around her name. The investigation rested, not because the truth had been found, but because there was nowhere left to look. And yet, somewhere beyond the interviews and the timelines and the assumptions, the answer still existed. It was waiting, not in testimony or memory, but in the physical world, buried beneath years of silence, ready to surface only when chance finally disrupted the calm that had protected it for far too long. Time did what it always does in places like that. It moved forward without asking permission. The years after the disappearance passed unevenly. Some days felt unbearably long, others vanished without leaving a trace. Seasons stacked on top of each other, winters came and went, crops grew and were harvested, roads were repaved, stores changed owners. Life, in all its ordinary persistence, continued. The girl's parents aged visibly. Their hair grayed faster than they expected. Lines settled into their faces in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with strain. In the early years, they marked each passing month, then each year. Eventually, they stopped marking time at all. It hurt too much to measure what had been lost. Her room stayed mostly the same. At first, it was preserved exactly as she left it, clothes still folded, toys untouched. Later, the door stayed closed more often, not because she was forgotten, but because the silence inside the room was too loud. Every object carried weight, every memory demanded attention. In town, the disappearance slowly faded into the background. New families moved in who had never seen the flyers when they were fresh. Children enrolled in the same school without knowing why some teachers still paused when they walked past the gravel road. To them, it was just another stretch of countryside. To others, it remained frozen in 2001. The case file never officially closed. It couldn't. There was no body, no proof of death, no answer to circle in red ink. Instead, it lived in a gray space, cataloged but untouched. Detectives who had worked it early in their careers retired or transferred. Their notes remained, but the urgency did not survive them. A new generation of officers inherited the case. They opened a box containing yellowed reports, grainy photographs, and interview transcripts that felt distant even to those who had written them. They read through timelines that ended abruptly. They saw the same names repeated, the same questions unanswered. With no new evidence, there was little they could do. Periodically, the file was reviewed. Sometimes a detective would call the family just to remind them the case still existed. Those calls were both comforting and painful. They reopened hope without offering substance. The uncle's life moved forward in ways that drew no attention. He married, he worked steady jobs. He became, to most people, just another man living in the area. There was no arrest, no public suspicion, no reason for his name to surface again. If anyone harbored private doubts, they kept them private. Accusations without proof had nowhere to go. Within the family, the fracture deepened quietly. Grief expressed itself differently in different people. Some wanted to talk about the girl constantly, keeping her memory alive through repetition. Others avoided her name, not out of neglect, but survival. Those differences created distance. Distance turned into resentment. Resentment hardened into silence. Holidays were the worst. An empty chair at the table never blended into the background, no matter how many years passed. Birthdays became complicated. How do you acknowledge a life paused at 10 years old? How do you imagine who she would have been at 16, at 20, at 30, without unraveling? Without remains, mourning stayed incomplete. There was no funeral, no grave, no moment that marked an ending. The absence denied closure. It demanded patience instead. And patience, stretched over years, turned into exhaustion. Occasionally, a tip would come in. Someone thought they recognized her in another state. Someone claimed to know something, but could never quite explain what. Each lead was followed just enough to confirm it led nowhere. Each one left the family slightly more hollow than before. The town learned how to carry the story without speaking it. Parents who had once walked search lines now walked their grandchildren to school. The gravel road remained, unchanged, blending into the landscape as if nothing had ever happened there. The woods grew thicker, trails shifted. Nature reclaimed places that had once been searched inch by inch. The uncle attended family events less frequently over time, not out of avoidance, but because distance had grown naturally. No one accused him, no one confronted him. The unspoken. Suspicion, if it existed, stayed buried under years of politeness and fatigue. 16 years is long enough for details to blur, but not long enough for grief to disappear. The girl's name still surfaced occasionally, usually in quiet moments, usually when no one else was listening. Her parents wondered privately if they would ever know the truth, or if uncertainty was what they would carry to their graves. By 2017, the case had become one of many, a number in a database, a folder on a shelf. Detectives knew it by reputation more than by substance. Missing child, rural area, no evidence, unsolved. And then, without warning, something changed. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a witness, it wasn't a new technology breakthrough or a sudden memory regained. It was chance. The kind of chance no investigation can plan for and no timeline can predict. A place long assumed to be quiet, empty, and irrelevant was disturbed, not by a search party or a detective, but by routine work. The kind of work that happens every day without consequence. And buried beneath years of leaves, soil, and silence, something waited. Something small, something overlooked for more than a decade. Something that did not speak, but did not need to. After 16 years of nothing, the truth was about to surface in the most unexpected way, forcing a case long resigned to uncertainty back into motion, and pulling every assumption made since 2001 into question. In the spring of 2017, the conservation area was quiet in the way it usually was on weekdays. Trails that filled with families on weekends sat mostly empty, disturbed only by wind moving through branches and the occasional sound of boots against packed earth. The park ranger had worked that land for years. Trail maintenance was routine, clearing debris, checking erosion, making sure paths were safe and passable. Nothing about that day suggested it would be different. While inspecting a narrow section of trail near a wooded edge, the ranger noticed something that did not belong. It wasn't obvious at first, just a faint glint beneath layers of dead leaves and soil, the kind of thing most people would step over without a second thought. But familiarity with the land makes small details stand out. The ranger knelt down, brushed away leaves, and uncovered a small metal object. It was a locket. Time had not been kind to it. The metal was rusted, the hinge stiff. Dirt filled its grooves, but it was unmistakably jewelry, and it was unmistakably out of place. Trails accumulated trash sometimes, but not like this. Not buried, not old. The ranger followed protocol. The object was left untouched, coordinates were noted, local authorities were contacted. What began as a routine maintenance call shifted tone almost immediately once the locket was photographed and logged. When investigators compared it against records, something stopped them cold. The missing persons report from 2001 mentioned a locket, a small piece of jewelry the girl often wore. The description was brief, almost an afterthought at the time, but it was there. 16 years after the disappearance, the first physical link to her was sitting in an evidence bag. The area was secured within hours. What had been an unremarkable patch of woods became a controlled site. Forensic teams arrived, moving carefully, methodically, treating every inch of ground as potentially significant. The discovery point was expanded into a grid. Soil was sifted, leaves were bagged, nothing was rushed. As the search widened just beyond the locket's location, additional items began to surface. Small fragments at first, fabric fibers embedded in the dirt, buttons degraded by moisture and time. Each piece was photographed, cataloged, and removed with deliberate care. Then came what no one wanted to find, but everyone had expected: degraded human remains. The condition made immediate identification impossible, but context mattered, location mattered, proximity to the locket mattered. There was no longer room for uncertainty about whether the girl had survived. The question shifted, brutally and definitively, from where she was to what had happened to her. When the family was notified, there was no dramatic reaction, no collapse, no screaming, just a quiet confirmation of something they had carried for years without proof. The pain was sharp, but it was also different. Final, in a way grief had never been allowed to be before. For investigators, the case changed overnight. What had once been a missing person investigation was now a homicide. Evidence, even delayed, reactivated procedures that had been dormant for over a decade. Old files were pulled from storage. Interview transcripts were reread line by line. Timelines were reconstructed with new context. The location itself raised immediate questions. The conservation area was miles from the girl's home and her usual route. It was not a place she would have wandered to accidentally. Someone had brought her there. Someone who knew it existed. Someone comfortable enough with the area to believe it would remain undisturbed. That realization narrowed the field dramatically. Investigators revisited every person who had been close to the girl in 2001. But this time, the lens was sharper. They were no longer asking hypotheticals. They were aligning statements against geography. Who knew this land? Who had access? Who could reach it without drawing attention? The uncle's name resurfaced quickly. In the original investigation, his statements had been acceptable, vague but plausible. Now they were examined alongside the newly discovered location. It became clear that he had knowledge of the conservation area that others did not. He had visited it before. He had reason to be there. He knew how secluded certain sections were. Investigators compared his timeline from 2001 against travel distances. What once seemed like harmless gaps now looked different. A period of time he had been. Unable to account for aligned uncomfortably well with the distance between the girl's walking route and the site where the locket was found. There was still no rush to judgment. 16 years of silence had taught investigators caution, but the difference now was leverage. Physical evidence created pressure. It gave weight to questions that had once floated unanswered. Forensic analysis continued. Soil composition on the locket was compared to soil at the recovery site. Fibers were tested. While degradation limited certainty, patterns began to form, enough to support the conclusion investigators were already reaching. The remains were confirmed to be the girl's. That confirmation rippled outward. The town reacted in a muted way, grief resurfacing but restrained by time. For some, the news reopened wounds they thought had healed. For others, it finally validated fears they had never spoken aloud. The uncle was contacted again. This time, the conversation was different. He was no longer being asked to help. He was being asked to explain. Investigators questioned him about the conservation area, about his familiarity with it, about discrepancies between his original statements and what was now known. At first, he answered the way he always had, calm, cooperative, but the tone shifted as details tightened. Questions became more specific. Distances were named, times were clarified. Silence stretched longer between responses. The locket changed everything. It was small, unassuming, but it carried weight no witness ever could. It placed the girl somewhere she could not have reached alone. It contradicted years of assumptions. It transformed suspicion into direction. Investigators began building a case, not on speculation, but on alignment, location, opportunity, knowledge, time. Each piece fit more cleanly than anyone wanted it to. For the family, the discovery brought conflicting emotions: relief that she had been found, horror at the confirmation of her fate, fear of what the truth might reveal, and an unspoken realization that the answers they were about to receive might come from a place far closer than they had ever imagined. The mystery, dormant for 16 years, was no longer abstract. It was tangible. It existed in evidence bags and lab reports. It lived in a stretch of woods once thought irrelevant. It demanded resolution. And as investigators closed in, the man who had stood beside the family for years, who had been trusted implicitly, began to understand that the ground beneath him had finally shifted. The locket in the leaves had not just reopened a case, it had exposed a truth that had been waiting, patiently, for the moment when silence would no longer protect it. With the recovery of physical evidence, the case stopped being theoretical. For the first time in 16 years, investigators were no longer asking questions into a void. They had a location. They had remains. They had an object that tied the girl unmistakably to a place she could not have reached on her own. The investigation shifted into a phase that demanded answers, not patience. When the uncle was contacted again, the tone was noticeably different from every interaction before it. This was no longer a conversation rooted in sympathy or shared loss. It was structured, deliberate, and grounded in evidence. Investigators came prepared, armed with maps, timelines, and forensic findings that had not existed during earlier interviews. Technology had changed, methods had evolved, and time, which had once protected him, now worked against him. At first, he responded the way he always had: calm, cooperative, familiar. He spoke about the girl with the same measured sadness he had shown for years. He answered questions about his routine, his work, his movements, but the questions no longer floated loosely. They were anchored to specifics. Distances were named, locations were referenced, time frames were narrowed. Investigators placed the conservation area directly into the conversation. They asked how well he knew it, how often he had been there, what reason he might have had to travel through that section years earlier. His answers slowed. He paused more frequently. Small inconsistencies emerged, not dramatic contradictions, but subtle shifts that betrayed strain. The confidence he had carried for years began to erode. They returned to his original statements from 2001, reading them aloud, placing them alongside what was now known. What once seemed harmlessly vague now appeared strategically imprecise. A window of time he had never fully accounted for suddenly aligned too well with the distance between the girl's walking route and the site where her remains were found. Investigators did not accuse him outright. They didn't need to. They allowed the weight of the evidence to speak. They explained how soil analysis connected the locket to the recovery site, how the location itself ruled out accident or wandering, how familiarity with the area mattered, how someone without that knowledge would not have chosen it. The pressure was different this time, not aggressive, not emotional, just unavoidable. As the interview progressed, the uncle's posture changed. His responses shortened. His eyes dropped more often to the table. Silence stretched longer between questions and answers. Investigators waded through it. Silence, they knew, often did the work for them. Eventually, the story he had carried for 16 years could no longer hold its shape. The confession did not come with drama. There was no outburst, no attempt to justify what he had done. It came quietly, almost mechanically, as if he were reciting something he had rehearsed internally for years. The girl trusted him. That trust was the door that opened everything. He explained that the crime happened quickly. There was no prolonged struggle, no witnesses, no noise loud enough to draw attention. In a place where familiarity bred comfort, no one thought twice about seeing a child with a family member. That was the shield. That was how he moved unnoticed. Afterward, he transported her to the conservation area, a place he believed would remain undisturbed. He chose it deliberately. It was remote enough to avoid casual discovery, but familiar enough that he felt confident navigating it. He hid what he could, burying objects shallowly, assuming time and nature would do the rest. For 16 years, that assumption held. He lived freely, not because he was clever, but because no one wanted to believe the truth. Family members were not supposed to be capable of such acts. That belief protected him more effectively than any lie ever could. When the confession was complete, there was no relief in the room, only a heavy stillness. Investigators had what they needed, but they understood what it had cost: a child lost, a family destroyed, a town forced to confront the idea that the danger had never come from outside. The arrest followed swiftly. The legal process moved with a clarity the investigation had never had. Charges were filed, evidence presented. The locket, once an overlooked detail in a missing persons report, became a central exhibit, not just a personal item, but a silent witness that had waited years to be found. In court, the story was laid out in plain terms. No embellishment, no attempt to soften the reality. The girl had trusted someone she was taught to trust. That trust was betrayed in the most final way possible. The conviction brought a form of accountability, but it did not bring comfort. There was no sentence that could restore what had been taken. There was no verdict that could rewind time. What it offered instead was resolution, a line drawn where there had only been uncertainty. For the family, hearing the truth was both devastating and necessary. It confirmed their worst fears, but it ended the endless cycle of wondering. They could finally name what had happened. They could finally mourn without questions interrupting every memory. The town reacted in quiet reflection. Shock lingered, not because the crime was violent, but because it was intimate, familiar. The realization that the man who had stood beside the family, who had joined searches and offered comfort, was responsible forced a reckoning that extended beyond the case itself. People revisited their memories, searching for signs they might have missed. There were none that stood out clearly. That was the point. He had not hidden. He had blended. The girl's name returned to public conversation, this time with clarity instead of mystery. She was no longer just the child who vanished. She was the child who was found. The child whose story had an ending, even if it was not the one anyone wanted. The locket, once a symbol of innocence, took on new meaning. It was no longer just an object she wore. It became the piece that broke 16 years of silence, the thing that refused to stay buried, the reminder that truth does not disappear simply because it is ignored. In the end, the case did not close with spectacle. There were no dramatic twists left, only facts, a confession, a conviction, and a community forced to accept that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it stands close, speaks softly, and waits patiently. The mystery ended not with comfort, but with understanding. And in that understanding, the girl was finally returned to the town that lost her. Her story no longer unfinished, her absence no longer unexplained. What remained was the quiet aftermath, the knowledge that justice, when it finally comes, does not heal everything, but it does something equally important. It tells the truth.